Welcome to today's virtual panel discussion. I am Ricardo Rivera, your host from the American College of Healthcare Executives National Office. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items. For the purposes of noise control, your lines will be muted for the duration of the session unless there is an active discussion, at which point you may unmute yourself to talk. You will also have the opportunity to submit questions throughout the discussion through the chat panel, so please feel free to submit your questions as needed during the discussion. Today's session is worth 1.5 hours of face-to-face education credit. Credit will be applied to your ACHE account approximately 2 weeks following the end of the session based on your attendance and completion of the evaluation. To ensure your credit is applied, please be sure you are using the Zoom platform on a computer or the Zoom app on your smartphone. Also, be sure the name you use for the Zoom session matches the name of your registration. This session is being recorded and will be available within 48 hours by navigating to your My ACHE account and selecting My Online Learning from the Helpful Links section on the right side of the screen. Now, allow me to introduce Nicole Radford. Nicole, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Nicole Radford. I am the Director of Laboratory Services at Swedish American Hospital, a division of UW Health, and I'm also the chair of the Education Committee for our chapter of ACHE. I'm sure you guys have gotten lots of emails from me. Sorry to blow up everybody's emails. I say that all the time. But I am very, very proud to be the moderator of this session, our last session for 2020. And we have a fantastic panel of people to be able to speak with us on the equity of care. So if we've ever had any doubts in the past that the equity of care is an important topic, I think 2020, this wonderful, wonderful year we've had so far, has really pointed it out. I mean, we've had a pandemic of unprecedented proportions. We also have had lots of social unrest this year that has really made us all start thinking. The landscape of our country is truly changing. We've seen it, we've heard it, we know it. This certainly makes diversity and inclusion a very, very important and strategic necessity for all of our organizations. Though this is known, that divide certainly still exists. Unfortunately, those in populations that are uninsured and underinsured, low-income families, racial and ethnic minorities, as well as the LGBTQ communities are experiencing the unfortunate fallout from these disparities. These deficits change the way that healthcare is delivered as well as the way that it's financed. And once again, and I can't say it enough, it increases and leads to that increase of how imperative it is to address it. There's been policy changes such as the Affordable Care Act that has attempted to change it, is attempting to change it. However, that only goes so far. We all, as leaders and professionals and providers, have a responsibility to as well do our part. We are fortunate to have three professionals on our panel who have invested their time, energy, and effort in this fight. They've got different perspectives. They see it from different angles. They work on the issues from those different angles, and they're surely going to provide us with a very well-rounded approach to this important subject. I'd first like to introduce to everyone Dr. Jonna Cooley. I'm sorry, Dr. Jonna Cooley. Let me read her bio to everyone. She's the executive director of the Phoenix Center, Central Illinois' LGBTQ Community Center. It's located in Springfield, Illinois, and it offers various groups, services, training, social and educational events, as well as transitional housing. Dr. Cooley holds a master's degree in counseling and a PhD in psychology. She has over 34 years. Please pardon us, I am still here at the hospital. She has over 34 years in social services and has led her organization since April 2006. She is an adjunct associate professor at University of Illinois, Springfield, and was selected as the 2016 Greater Springfield Chamber Non-for-Profit Director of the Year. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Cooley.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I've been tasked to go first to talk about some medical disparities from the LGBT perspective, kind of as from a client perspective. And when I say client, I'm speaking on behalf of myself as a member of the LGBT community, but also combining stories from various clients and friends and individuals that have encountered issues with the medical community in the past, several years. I think sometimes we think that maybe there's not really medical disparities within the LGBT community. I talk about this and people look at me like they don't know what I'm talking about, that they don't see that, people in the medical community. But if you look at the statistics, I mean, in terms of being LGBT, your likelihood as a gay man to have HIV is certainly much higher than any other group. 70% of new infections are men who have sex with men. LGBT people are twice as likely to use substances. They have a higher likelihood of obesity, breast cancer, cervical cancer, mental health issues, various other types of medical concerns. And so it's like, why is this happening? Why are these medical disparities there? And I think that the best way for me to look at this, and the best way that I've been able to explain it, is to look at it from the perspective that a lot of this starts very early. As someone who grew up in a very small town where you had no one that you identified with or that was out as LGBT, particularly in the time frame that I grew up, there's a lot of negativity surrounding being lesbian or being transgender, or even talking about other racial and ethnic issues, or even religion, or any other group. And so you start hearing these negative messages very young, and unfortunately that still happens today with parents that are not supportive. And so with those negative messages, there's a lot of internalized homophobia that develops, and people have a difficult time not only telling people who they are, but they have a difficult time even accepting who they are. And so from that, people tend to develop anxiety issues and depression, and the eating disorders come along with that. You try to find ways to cope with what it is that you're doing, what it is that you're feeling and going through. And so I think that a lot of this starts in childhood, certainly evolves into adolescence and adulthood. There's a lot of negative comments and hate surrounding being part of the LGBT community, and not only just in your day-to-day activities, but when you go into a medical facility to see a physician about a specific issue, or just a regular checkup, or whatever, a lot of people in the LGBT community, particularly transgender individuals, experience some very negative things, some very negative comments. Sometimes people think that they're trying to be helpful, or that they are, trying to say the right thing, when in fact it too is very hurtful. I'm sure that you've all heard of something called microaggressions, things that people say that they're not really even necessarily intending to be hurtful. Some microaggressions that I've heard personally, or have had people report to me. I remember a young girl coming to me about 10 years ago who had been to a medical provider, and she was telling me about this negative experience she had had. And she had told the doctor, I think she was 16 or 17, and she told the doctor that she was a lesbian, and the doctor's response was, well, that's too bad, because I'm sure there's some nice young man out there for you. And so there's still medical providers that see this as as something that people are choosing, and talking about someone's chosen lifestyle. I mean, those are things that people take offense to. That there are things like a trans person. Numerous trans people have reported to me going to see medical providers and then feeling that they are having to educate their providers about being trans. And, I think that it's important that if, you don't have to be an expert in LGBT health, but certainly learn the specific concerns of the population. Because if you have a transgender male who is presenting to you, it's important to know that that person may still need you to do a PAP or a mammogram, depending on what procedures or that person has had or not had. And so we have to look outside of the box, and we have to think about ways that we can acknowledge each individual person based on what they're presenting to us or what they are telling us. I've had people report that they've just simply gone up to the front desk and said, "Can I use your restroom?" And then somebody responding with, "Well, what are you?" Or, "Which bathroom do you need?" And just things like that, to have policies and procedures in place that address those issues so that when they do come up, there's not anything uncomfortable for the staff person or the person who's there for services. Just really looking at the fact that, so many people have dealt with a life of fear and rejection. And if they get that in a medical setting, it's going to be a situation where they are unlikely to return. And so that's why we see a lot of these medical disparities, because people are afraid to go in and receive services. So I just think it's important to think about, things like your forms. What are you asking on your forms, and are you getting the information that you want to get or that you need to get to provide the best services that you can? If your form asks sex, what does that mean? Does it mean biological sex? Does it mean who you're having sex with? Or does your word sex actually mean gender? Because when a trans person reads that, they're not really sure what you're asking. And then if you interpret it differently, you may or may not even know that you're talking to a person who has biology different than their identity. And so it's just important to look at those forms. It's important to think about, when someone comes into your space, do they feel welcome? Are there things there that make them feel welcome? Are there, maybe signage that indicates that you are open to see everyone, that you are inclusive, that you are welcoming? Put up a pride flag, put up signs that show same-sex couples, or you could put up signage that has individuals of various races and ethnicities. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to make people feel welcome, and really look at not only training people within your work environment, the direct service providers, but sometimes the key people are the people at the front desk, the person answering the phone, the person who that patient's going to interact with first, and that can make that lasting impression. So just thinking about some of those sorts of things that you could do to change your environment, and then looking at ways and terminology that you can use to make a person feel more comfortable when they're in your environment. A personal story that I have is my wife has stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. And so we've been dealing with medical providers for since 2017 regarding her cancer. And we've gone to doctors where I've been introduced as her wife, and we are treated phenomenally. Asking me, what can we do? What do you need? How are you doing? In addition, knowing that I'm the support person. And then we'll go to another, doctor who maybe we are just meeting for the first time or haven't had, any interaction with yet. And I was introduced as the wife. And then when it got time for my wife to go back, the person that came to the door to get her said, "Your friend can come along too." So, just minimizing the relationships, it's very hurtful. We've been together 20 years, and we certainly have much more than a friendship. And so just thinking about your terminology, and I guess the last thing that I want to mention is that, we all have our own values and biases. And, sometimes it's difficult to make that fit with the job or the work that we're doing. And the best advice I can give is, if you have biases against or about same-sex relationships or transgender individuals or certain races or ethnicities or religions or whatever. Those are all things that you have to kind of check at the door. It's kind of like leave the baggage at the door, because you cannot provide the utmost in care with compassion and caring if you are packing around that baggage that is gonna that's not gonna allow you to see this person for who they are. And so with that, I'm going to stop here and see if anybody has any questions. And I want to thank you again for letting me be a part of this. And I will turn it back over.
Wow, powerful, Dr. Cooley. Thank you so very much. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Cooley before we move on? And you, of course, you can always ask questions as we go, and we will definitely have time at the end for questions and answers. All right. Well, before I turn it over to Dr. Christensen, I wanted to point out a couple of things that I heard from what Dr. Cooley had to say. It was great insight on the medical needs for not only your clients that you service, but also for the insight you gave from your own self, your own experience. And what my biggest takeaway is that sensitivity and compassion, or the lack thereof, has that potential of negatively affecting and creating disparities that we don't intend for it to. And I loved your check your biases at the door. I love that. That is something we definitely have to remember. Great, great stuff. All right, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kyle Christensen next. Dr. Christensen practices medicine at the vibrant Unity Point Prairie Parkway Clinic in Cedar Falls, Iowa. In 2018, he also founded Unity Point Health's first dedicated LGBTQ plus clinic. Dr. Christensen's career goal is to redesign the healthcare experience, where care is safe, relevant, timely, equitable, and valued. He has over 24 years of experience in the medical field. He graduated from Roy J. Lucille A. Carver, I hope I said that right, College of Medicine at University of Iowa Medical School. We are so honored to have you. Thank you.
Thank you. Just joy to be with all of you. And thank you for this chance to gather. And I really look forward to a good conversation. And I just really want to pause and thank Jonna for again, sharing that story and really setting the stage for us as we kind of leap into conversation. And so I hope to kind of be a transition piece before we really hear some great things from Melanie and have a good conversation. So again, my name is Kyle Christensen. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm a physician in Eastern Iowa, and we started a clinic because of what John outlined. And I think that's one of the principles that I want us to think about here as leaders in our respective areas, is the first step to doing anything about improving the healthcare experience is we have to see the problems. We have to be willing to see and look and see those problems. And that sometimes takes a perspective shift, but sometimes it really, we need to put ourselves in someone's shoes. Sometimes we just simply need to open our eyes and let the scales fall off, because those opportunities are in front of us. The problem often is that we refuse to see it. We have infections that are preventable in our healthcare places of service that we just say, well, that's the cost of doing business and taking care of sick people. That we describe patients as non-compliant because they don't come to an office visit or fill their medicines, but we really haven't asked those important questions to understand that, in fact, they don't have transportation to our office, or that they're struggling to pay for food this month. And so we need to, I think, be willing to start seeing those problems. And to me, I think that's at the core of equity, is no longer accepting the status quo, that it's somebody else's job, or that it's simply too hard to do. And so it's all of our job to do this work. And so I hope the principles we talk about and think about, that I'll be kind of focusing on with LGBTQ, I hope you all see that they do transcend the LGBTQ population, and they look at all of us particularly ways that we can seek out to care for our most vulnerable folks or those that are marginalized traditionally. So there are barriers that our society has put up that are legal barriers. There are social barriers to good access for LGBTQ folks. But those disparities, as John has described, they extend into the healthcare arena. Do you hear what I just said? Care. Care is in the word. This is what we do. It has care in the term, and yet it doesn't look very caring when we hear some of the terms and just the stories that John had described, particularly for transgender folks. People saying, folks saying, I felt abused when I came to your office. You blamed me for my health issues. You used abusive language. Actually, 1 out of 5 transgender folks were refused to be seen in healthcare because they were transgender. So that doesn't sound very caring. And if all those are the past experience that one might have in the healthcare arena, guess how likely someone might be to come see us when they really need us? And how likely are they going to come see us when they're talking about preventive care or do cancer screenings or take care of my diabetes? If we in healthcare are not seeing someone for their most authentic self, how much do you think they really care what their A1C is for their diabetes? We have to, again, recognize that this is the way that we can start to make that bridge, is make it safer, make it more welcoming. So when we recognized here in my team that this gap existed, that we had patients that were driving 2 hours to 6 hours just to access care that felt culturally vulnerable, that was something that we recognized as being absurd. And so my first prescription to all of you is see those opportunities for what they are, identify those gaps, and commit to fixing them. And you may not even know how or what the next step might be, but the first step is to commit to fix. And they're abound, they are all around us, but see them and then commit to fix. So what we committed to do was to create a safer, more welcoming place to access orientation and gender affirming healthcare. And we sought what was needed in our community. So we met with a lot of focus groups. We did a lot of questionnaires. We tried to understand what the gap really was and what would it look like if we could create and redesign that clinic experience from the ground up. What should it look like? What would you want in our community? Well, it turned out that primary care was really needed. So we committed to this primary care clinic that was LGBTQ focused. Every team member has gone through safe zones training, so that de facto sensitivity training for LGBTQ. And we continue to do that training on a regular basis. So we meet every 2 weeks, and that's ingrained into our huddles and processes. We are celebrating our 3-year anniversary here in just a couple of weeks. And we're just delighted to be that very visible leader just in our community for healthcare. Several hundred unique patients now, national recognition, got published in JAMA this week even. So we're pleased to be that leader and tell the story, because we think that's an essential part of this. So my prescription number 2 here is to hear those stories. So the stories like Jonna told us, stories that patients could tell us abound, but we need to make it safe and appropriate and hear those stories from our patients and from our workforce about where those gaps exist. Be, as leaders, the best story gatherer you can be. So be the best in your organization at gathering those stories around in every contact you have, and then start to pollinate and share those stories across the organization. So those stories that you hear might be the ones we're talking about in terms of those gaps. So let's listen to those stories that describe a gap, but sometimes there are also stories that tell us what we're doing extremely well. And that's something we ought to share as well. But be the best story gatherer and pollinator of stories in your organization if you want to change the culture and do more for diversity, equity, inclusion. And then the final part that I want to share is the importance of small. So do small things to make big changes. And I think sometimes one of the challenges for leaders is that, gosh, this feels overwhelming to think about, how do we stand up an organization like Jana did? How do we start a clinic like this? So the lesson here is just start where you are, do one small thing, and continue to progress. We don't need to have perfection, be the enemy of good. We don't need to get into committees and think about this for 3 years. Let's just start where you are. So solve one small thing, and then you'll see that flywheel start to build and work. So examples of that is our clinic. Now 3 years in the running. We meet twice a month for the clinic. It's multidisciplinary, multi-specialty. Every team member knows their purpose. And we know that because as we convene and connect, we do some type of centering exercise. We connect together again why we are meeting to serve this population over these next few hours tonight. And I'll tell you, that really helps the team, again, get really engaged in a very chaotic, busy, challenging time. Every clinic, work on one improvement. We just try to make one thing different. Maybe it's how we're going to collect and document the vitals tonight. Maybe it's how we're going to introduce ourselves with pronouns. Maybe it's how we're going to make sure that the checkout process is smooth and efficient and safe. So we're going to make one process improvement change every night. And the final thing we do is we share what we call our joy bombs. And so every night at the finish, we talk about what was one small thing that you found connection and purpose and with your mission in medicine. And again, some person that finally got their diabetes under control, or someone sharing their coming out story with a family member that went positive. Sometimes it's, when I first saw this patient 6 months ago, depression and anxiety scores were through the roof. But they came out tonight and told me that, being seen and being made authentic in this clinic space, being honored, their chosen name being utilized and pronouns being honored, that they felt seen for the first time in their life. And for the first time in their life, they care about their health. We've always cared about it as their provider, but they now care too. And to see those kinds of moments, that's how we finish our time together, is what we call joy bombs. And that's how we send our team home, steeped in that knowledge that they have value and steeped in their purpose and reconnection to healthcare. So it's our own little commitment to burnout. So my ask to all of you is what kind of stories do you want people saying about your organization? Those stories are out there right now. So let's listen to them, and let's maybe commit to improvement when a story describes a gap. But let's celebrate when a story describes something we're doing well. Let's commit to changing when we find those gaps, even if you don't know how, you do know the why. And then just start where you are. Don't have to make grandiose changes. Start where you are. Do cheap things to make someone else feel special in those clinical experiences. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Christensen. How powerful. And happy anniversary to you and your clinic. Wonderful, wonderful work. I love the points that you made about how it all starts with us being willing to see. We've got to open our eyes and be willing to see. And one other point that I'd like to make is about the point that you made about the care in healthcare and how that includes the caring. And it made me think actually of someone that I know, someone that I love, who is actually obese. And along those same lines, she has a hard time going in to see her provider because she's been burnt before. She's been blamed before for being overweight. And I've seen the hurt that she's gone through. So it makes sense that that would negatively affect any patient. So very good. Thank you for sharing. All right. And audience, don't forget to put your questions in the chat box as you get them so you don't forget them. And we'll also talk a little bit more later as well. All right, so I have the pleasure of introducing our third panelist, Dr. Melanie Andrews. Dr. Andrews practices medicine at Unity Point Family Medicine in Peoria. where she is also the site lead physician. She attended Loyola University of Chicago, where she earned her BA in sociology with a double major in biology and women's studies in 2006. At LUC, she received departmental honors and was inducted into Alpha Sigma Nu, the Jesuit Honor Society. She received her medical degree from the Milton S. Hershey Penn State College of Medicine, where she was inducted into the Gold Humanism Honor Society. While completing her family medicine residency at the University of Illinois College of Medicine in Peoria, she was selected by the resident as Faculty Teacher of the Year and recently was named Peoria's top 25 women in leadership. Great job. She chairs the Unity Point Hospital Diversity and Inclusion Leadership Advisory Council and is the physician site lead for the Family Medical Center, the residency teaching clinic. Welcome, Dr. Andrews.
Thanks. Like as you were introducing me, someone walked into the room. I'm like squatting in the hospital a little bit because I actually got pulled for our COVID surge team this week. So this was a little unexpected. So I apologize. But thank you, Nicole. And thank you, Dr. Cooley and Dr. Christensen as well for kind of, leading in with those powerful stories. To add to that introduction, my pronouns as well are she and hers, which is something that we're still struggling to incorporate in our residency. And actually, one of our tangible things was that we put stickers on our badges to remind us. One of our residents asked and ordered them all. So when you think about your small things, like it could be a sticker. So that's pretty cool. And then, from my perspective, we kind of went from some of the micro things and community-based things into what I'm going to talk about or focus on is really some of the macro and the system level things. And as Nicole had mentioned, I chair our hospital's diversity and inclusion committee. And I think it's worth noting for everyone who can clearly see me that I am an affluent white woman, right? Who's sitting here that's still I think it's more awkward to not acknowledge that I am the chair of our diversity and inclusion committee that sits here saying these things, holding that position and holding that privilege and coming to speak on the panel, kind of knowing that like that's who I am and that's the perspective that I come from. And so when we started this in Peoria, I was really kind of nervous that this would become like another committee that went on for like 3 years and had nothing to come out of it. And so we really saw a need in our community as well, but at a broader scale. Peoria was unfortunately named in one of the local journals, nationally, as one of the worst places in the country for Black people to live when the Wall Street Journal had published their financial data. And so when we looked into that, that was based on a number of things, including socioeconomics, job prospects, healthcare, all of these things. And so I had attended some roundtable discussions with community leaders and the CEO of our hospital at that time. And our current CEO, Keith Knepp, had attended those as well. And so we had kind of started talking about what we were able to do from our end, living in the community, working in the community. And the residents and I at our program started talking about social determinants of equity and social determinants of health and how those things all tied together and what we could do about it. And so that was in 2016, 2017. And the committee was formed at our hospital. And we started thinking about kind of a few principles that have guided our work. And the first one really, truly for me has been something that I took out of my background as an undergrad in sociology and carrying forward, which has been nothing about us without us, right? So when you are looking at, and Dr. Christensen and Dr. Cooley spoke to this, both of them, when you're looking at a marginalized group or a community, that doesn't come from me. My perspective, when we're talking about race and ethnicity, my perspective is very different from the people that I'm trying to get at, as far as, you know, when I create a policy or when I create, make a healthcare decision, it may affect me just fine, but it may not affect the patient that I treat who's on Medicaid, who's Black, or who is Spanish speaking, or is an immigrant, or whatever the case may be. And so having those folks at the table when we're having those discussions about policy creation, about different health needs, is really key. And so this committee that we formed in the hospital, that was the same. And so we made sure that when we formed that, our committee looked like our community. That was really important. We also made sure that we had executive team representation there, that we had HR representation there. And as our groups kind of solidified what we wanted to accomplish and some of the projects that we were looking for, we changed who we had on the committee or who we needed to make sure that we had the right voices there. As we realized, oh, we're going to need more outpatient support, or oh, we're going to need inpatient from this department or that department. And then we started looking at we had really tough conversations, right? So race is not often, and especially when it comes to inequalities, and especially when you look back over this last summer, like when we very frankly talked about the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. We had those conversations in our hospital with our CEO, with our staff, at our meetings, in our hallways, those kind of things. And I know a lot of people think like, it's not really what we're doing here. We're kind of a healthcare institution. But it very much is, because those are the stressors that are affecting the way that our patients and our staff live their lives every day. And so they can't just turn it on or turn it off. And so we have to be mindful of that as you know, kind of how we're approaching that inside our hospital and outside. And so we also then can't back away from those conversations when they get really hard. And we also know that, like, I have been involved in some of this work in our hospital, like I said, for a number of years now. And sometimes I still say stuff that is really not okay, because I'm still struggling and I'm still white and I don't always get it. And so that's the time when you say, I'm really sorry, and then you do better, right? And so that's where we're kind of coming from with this. So my point with this is to say, you have to stay in the work when it's really hard. And this cannot be the work exclusively of people who are often marginalized. This cannot just be the work of people who are Black and brown, or immigrants, or people who are of, you know, the minority religion, wherever that may be for you. This has to be kind of like a whole community effort. This also can't be, again, coming back to my first statement of nothing about us without us. This can't just be a bunch of white people sitting around a table, right, making rules that have impact on other people. Like, that time is gone. Okay. And so when we looked down on some tangible things that we did and where we thought we could have the highest impact, we started thinking about getting at policy change, because so much of what we see in decision making really comes down to like a policy that we didn't think would have a consequence that it did. And so we started thinking about, well, how do we get at implicit bias? How do we get at systemic racism and systemic discrimination? How do we get at those things when they're really hard to see? You know, when we talk about, like, even the people involved in the work who are actively learning, who have been doing this for a long time, don't always see it until someone points it out to them. So, like I said, you have to have people around you who are different from you, who can say like, hey, you may not see this, but I see it. Have you thought of this? The way that you then do that is you have to have them hired in your institution to begin with. So we started with recruitment and retention. So one of the things that we looked at is we had HR come to join our committee first off. And we said, okay, well, what does our data look like for HR in the hospital for recruitment and retention? Reflective of our whole community. So if we're going to say, you know, it may be unrealistic, like we're in Peoria. And so if we have a certain percentage of, you know, Black males, or we have a certain percentage of Black females, then we may not get this, you know, we may not get 50% of our workforce being Black. Like, it has to be realistic to the population around you as well. And so we just want to start with being reflective of the community that we're serving. So how are we doing? So when we first looked at the data, we're like, oh, we're actually not too bad with some of these groups. Some groups we're really bad at. And so then we could target that out. But then we had another suspicion. You know, when we walk around the hospitals, I'm not so sure that we're actually seeing Black doctors, but I think we see a lot of Black cleaning staff. So where are we seeing the economic divide here? Are we seeing people in marginalized groups being promoted? Do they have a pathway to success that is equal or equitable compared to their white counterparts? And so when we broke it down by that data looking at pay structure, that's where we found work to do. And so then we were able to set targets. We're like, aha, okay. So we could take that back to our hospital board and actually say, these are our goals for recruitment and retention, and very clearly have some things then that we could say to our physician recruiters, to our nursing staff, for HR, like when we're going to be talking about physicians who serve our patient population, nursing staff who serve our patient population, people in the decision-making capacity who are saying yay and nay on these policies that have a direct impact on the quality of care of the patients that we serve in our community. We need people who can reflect the community broadly. And so again, that comes down to something where you have to be willing to dive into that data and actually look at it. We also looked at a review of policies to say, are we seeing like looking down, we found, sorry, there's somebody like trying to come to my room. We found out that we have a policy on policies. Which always makes me giggle a little bit, that we have somebody that actually created this of how policies get made. Because we're like, who signs off on these things? How are they created? And what we found is that there's no comment on race anywhere in the policies. There was, until very recently, no comment on gender in the policies. There was very broad language in there on the council of our legal department, talking about the way that policies are written being very broad. So actually looking at things like what pronouns are used and things like that was actually okay because they kept it super broad. But when we looked at it, there was never any questions about implicit bias. So we actually changed our policy creation format so that people were asked to consider what the potential negative impact of this policy would be on different groups who were employed in our hospital, different groups who were patients in our hospital. And we did it in a way so that it wasn't just a checkbox of like, hey, does this policy lead to any implicit bias, or do you see any negative impact on patient population in your hospital? Because then, right, it's hard, implicit bias is hard to see. And so if you have a policy that's created and people are like, no, this looks fine. Like this doesn't hurt anybody, right? No, it's good. And you check the box and you move on. You miss that a lot. And so one of the things we actually found that was a great example recently was our mom-baby separation for COVID positive patients disproportionately affected our African-American and Latino families because they were coming in. What we were seeing is that they were often in positions that tended to be on our Medicaid patients who oftentimes did not have extra family members at home to isolate with baby, because they tended to be in lower socioeconomic status, were often working, multi-generational households. And so we're like, these are moms that are not going to have a support provider being able to be with them, and quarantine at home and all these other things. And our patient population is such that most of our African American patients are in our young, especially our at FMC where I practice, because Medicaid is not taken in a lot of our private OB offices. Our patient population is often very young. So we're seeing 15, 16-year-olds where we're like, hey, if these women end up COVID positive, now we're having these moms labor by themselves, and they are 15, attending a delivery alone. That's also in a room full of almost entirely white physicians and white nursing staff, then being told they have to separate from their baby. And so we worked really hard to create a policy that was more equitable and helpful for that. And so when we were looking at this, that was something that was kind of an example of like a tangible thing that we could do. I'm gonna turn this back over to you for a second, Nicole, because I may have to get out.
Oh, no problem.
I'm squatting in the hospital.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andrews. The perils of our pandemic again strikes again. Oh my. All right. And so even though she's not still here, but she may not be able to hear the things that I say that I appreciate and got from her. I love the fact that when they were forming the committee, they did it so out of a need from the whole community. They recognized that the community had that need and looked at it from a perspective of, well, as she put it, nothing about us without us. So a very holistic approach to the health system as a whole. I mean, the fact that they mentioned recruitment and retention and policy review shows that they were committed to doing this, are committed. It's not past tense, they are still doing it. So, all right, with that, I think I'm going to ask a few questions. Once again, those of you in the audience, if you have any questions for our panel, just go ahead and type them into the chat box and we will continue talking. Dr. Christensen and Dr. Cooley, a quick question for you. She's so funny. See. Ricardo, can we stop her video just in case?
Sure thing.
Thank you. I would hate for her to make a mistake and show something that is not supposed to be shown. So, all right. What educational offerings has your organization provided your staff to develop skills and cultural competency to provide quality care to patients of diverse backgrounds? And whichever one of you want to take it first.
I'm happy to jump in. So yeah, part of our approach when we determined to work to fix things about 4 or 5 years ago was to do two things. One is to create the physical space, and that is the dedicated clinic that we have. It's a very physical space, and again, everything tells a story. As Jonna was describing, small things like posters or a flag, buttons with our pronouns on it, name badges, all those things tell a story. And so we create a very specific space that is dedicated to that type of notion. But the other part was to create a different dialogue in our community. And so particularly with LGBTQ folks, we committed to be in front of as many people as we possibly could. And so we try to speak in our community as much as we are able, creating new partnerships with groups like Jonna's group, we feel is essential. Connecting with the university in our community, connecting with business leaders. We know that leaning hard into diversity, equity, and inclusion actually has a business case to it. And so we just have had 3 recent hires that were difficult hires in our system that happened directly because, as they're Googling us, they determined and see that we have this very visible presence in serving the LGBTQ population. And so my CEO just connected with me a couple of weeks ago, said, 3 new hires because of what we, because, they came to the state because of the visible leadership. So we think that there's that's a great story that we want to continue to make the case to our other business leaders in our community. There's value in doing this from a recruitment and retention standpoint. And then finally, we believe at least the core of people that work in healthcare, that people really want to do the best thing, that people really do want to do the right thing. And I think too often, many of us are afraid that we're going to say the wrong thing, that we're going to put foot into mouth and do something that we didn't intend. And so a couple things happen. We either do the wrong thing, we actually do say something that's inappropriate, but more often than not, we miss the opportunity to do something really right. And so our goal has been to equip our colleagues in doing the right thing. We believe that that's their intent, so let's equip them. And so we've been doing basically an LGBTQ Healthcare 101. So it's basic terminology. It's understanding the difference between sex and gender. It's understanding that gender identity is not sexual orientation. And all these things that often are conflated when we talk about LGBTQ plus, some folks literally believe there is such a thing as an LGBTQ person. So we recognize that no, these are each individual identifications. The common experience, though, is one of discrimination. And so, but otherwise recognize that no, we have to tease apart all of those individual identities, and we can equip you in how to create a great moment. So you wonder about pronouns, we teach you how to do that. And so to date, we've done that to about a little over 2,000 people across the Midwest here.
Nice. Very good. Very good. Thank you for sharing. Dr. Cooley.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Dr. Christensen said there. And one of the things, we're a not-for-profit. We're a Central Illinois LGBT Community Center. And so as far as what we're doing with the medical community and other professionals, primarily educators, social workers, counselors, individuals who work directly with LGBT individuals, we found a lot of people coming to us saying the very same thing. We want to do better. We want to know more. I'm not sure what to say if X is presented. And so we created 2 trainings. One is a kind of an LGBTQ 101, and then we have a basics transgender intro kind of a course, and they both have CEUs attached for the providers, so that way there's certainly a benefit to them to do the training. But I think that the majority of people that come to those trainings and that we get questions from are exactly what he was saying with the I just want to do better. I want to know more. I want to say the right thing. And so I think a lot of times the things that happen that people, tell me about are not coming necessarily from a place of hate or person being purposeful, but I think it's just a lack of education and information. So we've just been really working hard to get that information out to those that are working in the front lines to make a difference and to reduce some of these disparities.
Very good. Very good. We've got Dr. Andrews back. I don't know if you could hear the question.
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
That's okay. No problem. The question was, what educational offerings has your organization provided your staff to develop skills and cultural competencies to provide quality care to patients of diverse backgrounds?
Yeah, so we have a series of cultural competency modules and trainings through HR of different levels. It's rolled out through our HR department at the hospital. And then we are working on now actually putting up on our hub, which is our like hospital kind of like intranet page, series of like short clip videos, and then places where they can go to get like information on different religious holidays or different ethnic celebrations or things like that, or even education on terms like microaggressions or implicit bias or things of that nature. But we wanted to do it in a way that showed it was coming from our own staff. So like videos and teaching like kind of blurbs and things that came from our own physician staff or our own nursing staff, so that it was people that they knew teaching this information. It wasn't just like, oh great, it's another like diversity training that we have to do to check a box as like a net module kind of thing, but that it was someone who celebrated, you know, Hanukkah, or somebody who celebrated you know, a different religious festival or whatever, talking about what that means to them and why they celebrate it and like some of their memories of that, so that it really humanizes that and really means something to them, and to the again, bringing it back to like being something meaningful for our community. So we've done things like that. In our realm, we focus mostly on race. And so one of the big issues that we've had has just been, we've implemented something called the Speak Up campaign. And that is actually, we did it through our university, the University of Illinois College of Medicine in Peoria is here. And we were finding some issues with that started actually on labor and delivery, not just at our hospital, but at the hospital that our obstetrics residency was at through the university. And this has actually been studied and looked at across the country, that there are certain areas of hospitals, and obstetrics being one of them, that's very highly tied to a lot of discriminatory policies, things like mandatory drug testing for, you'll see far higher in moms who come in who are Black than moms who are white. Things like that, the way that patients get treated and who is offered even pain medication after delivery and who isn't, is striking. It's amazing actually that we still have some of those things happening. And so what we did was we implemented this the Speak Up campaign here in our hospital, and then in the hospital across the street at OSF as a joint junction through the university. And it's something that you can do. It's a national program looking specifically at, for us, we put it in the context of race and racism, but it can be applied in a number of things. And basically, it's checking those things. Like when you hear something, it's really great for addressing microaggressions. When you're like, I think that like that didn't sound right, and it kind of caught me, and I'm not really sure. Can you explain what you meant by that? And man, you have somebody that says something that like was not okay, and you ask them to explain it, and they're like, ooh, no, that wasn't okay, and I'm sorry. And like, it gives you a rubric both for the people who are trained. All of our staff were trained in this, and our residents were trained in this, as well as our faculty. And it gives them both a rubric and a dynamic, so that the person who said it picks up on, you know, if I'm the one that said something and my resident says to me, can you explain what you just said to me? Or they use what we call cuss words. They use those phrases to me. It's an immediate thing that triggers for me, like, oh, I just said something that was not cool. And there's also tools for, you know, if you get into this where you're like, I don't have time, it's a high stress situation, or we don't have a lot of time right now, but it triggers you to be like, oh, something that was said right here, I have to circle back to later. And it gives you that vocabulary and that teaching to kind of come back to that and navigate some of those tougher conversations, where it takes all of that, there's no blame, there's no shame in that, there's no criticism. It takes a lot of those like angry things that people bring to some of those conversations out of it. So it's truly just like I need you to stop that, here's what we're doing, and moving on. So we use that Speak Out campaign to roll out in our hospital. We have done that in our OB floor. All of our new employees get that in orientation. And then we're doing that in our ER departments. And once COVID is over, we are rolling that in our ICU as well. So some of our higher stress, higher acuity areas are in our next wave of training for that program.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you guys so much for these wonderful answers. Very inspiring, that's for sure. I wanted to read to you guys what one of the attendees commented on earlier, Liz Levi. She said, gender identity is such a key area to ensure staff understand. I've found gender fluidity challenges many individuals. Her health system added a prompt of which gender do you identify with today, rather than sex or gender, to their intake flow. I think this is wonderful as it addresses non-binary and fluidity more robustly. I've found that to be so profound, and I wanted to make sure that everybody that's in attendance heard that and saw that. So thank you so much for sharing that, Liz. All right, we have a question. How are your systems handling the disparity created by telehealth? And either Dr. Andrews or Dr. Christensen, if you want to talk about that.
I can take that. We actually have had a really hard time doing telehealth because of this. Most of our patients, like I mentioned, are Medicaid, and because we're a teaching clinic, that's actually structurally how we're set up, because the resident salaries come from Medicaid and Medicare reimbursement. And so we have not done very many telehealth visits because of like most of our patients where they access internet is places like school and the library. There has been some talk in Peoria about mobile Wi-Fi, like vans and things like that to help with access to e-learning for schools, but has not panned out. We've gotten occasional like virtual visits from like telephone calls, but they haven't been great. So we've actually restructured for a time when back in the spring, when we were still very unsure with where everything was going and what COVID really was, and you know, all that fear and uncertainty that before we had any answers, we actually restructured our clinic assuming that we would not be able to do telehealth. We have a lot of homeless population. We have a lot of people who don't have phone access at all. And so that was just not an option. And so what we did was we risk stratified visits for them so that if we had patients who were immunosuppressed, pregnant, folks who were over the age of 65 and had certain comorbidities, we put them first thing in the morning and offered them first thing in the morning visits, and everybody else and sick visits were in the afternoon. One of the challenges that we've had is within our healthcare system, they've done like a virtual waiting room, which does not work very well at our office for this exact reason. Like we have, you know, people that even do have phone access that will say, oh, we're going to do a virtual waiting room, and we'll text, like, we'll, you know, text us when you get here and then wait in your car. And we're like, the bus dropped them off. Like this doesn't make any sense. So when people start thinking about how their organizations are going to employ some of these strategies, that needs to be a question that then you bring back to whoever's in charge of the clinic, whoever's in charge of making some of these decisions. And my suggestion in the way that we handle this isn't a, so what do, like a soft kind of like, okay, so what do we do about our bus riders kind of thing, or like, how is this going to work for bus riders? But like a very firm, like there has to be a plan for these people. It's not okay to just assume that like it'll get figured out, or that that like it'll just work, which has been sometimes our experience, is that like, oh well, the other offices are making it work really well, and you're like, the other offices don't have our patient population. But we've even talked about things like that, doing like iPads out in people's cars to keep them out in the way, out of the office if they didn't feel comfortable coming in, and things like that, so that they could pick up like hospital or clinic Wi-Fi that way.
Wow, powerful, very good. Dr. Christensen, have you guys experienced anything like that, or what's been your experience with telehealth?
And I think even beyond, the telehealth, just the way health, care construct is entirely, is, I'm hearing that just as a through line through Melanie's discussion is, just we're trying to transcend that thinking of come to my shiny tower, and you can do it between 9 and 5, and in that 15-minute slot I've given you. And so, so the concept of how can we meet people where they are, is important. I suspect most of our listeners are increasingly understanding the role of value-based care and importance of population health, and the future of healthcare reimbursement is not about fee for service, but a broader population, which you better believe is going to require that we do things very differently than the legacy. And so the creativity that Melanie's talking about is super important. So one little things that we're venturing into something called a SOTA, social determinant advocate. And we're trying to understand how to make it safe to self-disclose if I feel like I'm vulnerable. And then we're the next step of that is just, well, what can we do about it in healthcare? You didn't say it as much, Melanie, specifically, but you were saying it in every other thing you said. But 20% of one's wellness in our community is based on all the stuff we do in our hospitals and our office. 20%, 80%, of course, is determinants of health. And if we're increasing responsible for the wellness of a population, we damn well better get that figured out. And so, this is trying to find a space that we can figure out how to identify, first of all, first see it first. So we're landing on a question right now that we've been doing for about a year, which is, do you ever feel worried about making ends meet at the end of the month? And so we've tried a dozen different kind of screening questions, and this one seems to have the most responses. Now, when we have a positive, then we dig in a little bit deeper. That's through the social determinant advocate, kind of like a social worker role, if you will. And then they do a little deeper dive. And about 50% of the screens then turn into a transportation problem. So 50% of the time, it's a simple transportation problem. I say simple, but it's in that area. Now, sometimes it really is, money and heat and electricity, and but again, we can never understand how we can work on making these things better unless we start to look for them. We hope that telehealth actually becomes a way to reach people better, rather than creating more disparity, but actually be one more pathway that we can connect.
Very good. Thank you so much for sharing. Dr. Cooley, have any of your clients or anyone that has worked with you experienced issues, especially, beyond telehealth, but also just in general with the pandemic, especially because that seems to be magnifying the issues that we're seeing, but with that access to care, and especially right now when care is so desperately needed by so many?
Yeah, we actually have transitional housing. So we house homeless men and women who are HIV positive, and then we have a program for homeless men and women who are LGBT, who identify as LGBT NRQ. And so some of the things that we've seen, a big one I think is the inability for people to meet face to face with their therapists. A lot of therapists are doing Zoom meetings, and some people just simply don't find that as effective. And so that's been really hard for some people. And I think for our residents, a lot of people just enjoy the connection and having time one-on-one with this person. And so, the Zoom opportunity isn't the same for them. Um, and then I think that, just the isolation that this has created for individuals, because we've had to set rules where people, are not able to freely come and go from the building because of the fact that, they interact with other people living there. So I think those have been the two big issues for us with the pandemic. And then of course us being disconnected as a staff from the residents and from some of our clients, because we're trying to work from home as much as we can, and we have made accommodations in our facility to be able to continue our services that we provide. So we've been able to at least do a walk-up window for our harm reduction program and our HIV testing and hepatitis C testing. And then we also have created a mobile outreach unit so we can actually go to people if they are not comfortable, coming to Springfield or, leaving their house or whatever, so we can help them that way.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Once again, if anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat box. The last thing I'm going to ask as we start wrapping it up is I'd like for each of you, you each have given some very strong, powerful nuggets of information, but if I had to ask you for key takeaway or takeaways for the audience in order for them to replicate at their organizations, what suggestions and key takeaways would you have? And I'll start with you, Dr. Cooley, since you're our last speaker here.
Yeah, you didn't even give me a chance to think about that.
Well, I'm not going to put you on the spot. If either Dr. Christensen okay, you're good. Okay.
Okay, I'm good. I just had to think a second. So key takeaways in my perspective for medical providers would be to, sit down and talk with individuals that are from groups of that you really have very little knowledge of or contact with. I encourage people all the time. That's how I learned. I do LGBT trainings. I'm not GBT or any of the other numerous identities that people have, but I want to speak on behalf of the LGBTQ community. And so the best way for me to learn is to talk to people. And I've done focus groups with with individuals, with a transgender group, for example. And if you could tell the medical community anything that you possibly could, what would you want them to know? How would you want them to better provide services to you? So just talking to people and asking questions. And I think that some people will really get confused and all frustrated and discombobulated about, what do I do about these pronouns and what's that about? And, the way I deal with that is I just simply introduce myself to someone who comes in for services. My name's Jonna Cooley and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. How about you? And let them tell me their name and their pronouns. And I try to do that with everyone, because then you're not picking and choosing who you are going to ask this question of, and why are you asking me and you're not asking this person. And then it's also an educational opportunity for cisgender people to learn why we're asking, and it kind of opens the door for them to understand a little bit more about maybe what they should be doing. So I think that those are a couple of really key things that people can do. And I just think you just got to get involved. And like Dr. Christensen said, I think a big thing is just small things, all the small things that we can do to make a big difference.
Very good. Very good. Thank you so much. Dr. Christensen, would you like to go next?
Sure. Oh, that's all really terrific. Yeah, I really commit to see. So notice and see these opportunities where they are. Do that by listening to stories, do that by watching the data. There's a great discussion going on, right, about equality versus equity. Physicians love, maybe brag's not the right term, but we love to claim that we treat all our patients the same. Well, if we do that, we're not getting the same outcomes, folks. And so if we need to follow the data and say, well, why is this group of your patients having this outcome in their health and this group is having this outcome? You might treat them the same. You're having different outcomes. So let's start talking about what outcomes are we trying to achieve. And so sometimes follow the data to tell a story that there is a gap. So look and see these opportunities when they are there, commit to fix them. And again, I think so many of our healthcare teammates, they really want to do the right thing. And they do need to be coached and educated. So create the spaces where they can actually be equipped to create safer and more welcoming experiences, not only for our patients, but for our coworkers.
Very, very good. Very good. Thank you so much. Dr. Andrews, do you have anything to share?
Yeah, I think the takeaways for me are really, stay with whatever the work is when it's really hard. So when it feels really uncomfortable, I had heard a speaker, two women speaking about racial disparities and actually breastfeeding. And they had said, those, when it's really hard and you feel really uncomfortable, those are just growing pains. And I thought that was really a really great analogy. And so don't shy away from that, but try and push everyone, use that as an experience to help challenge yourself and to expand your work. And then, the other thing I cannot stress enough is that these decisions, whatever the project is, no matter how big or how small, like you have to get people from the community. So again, that nothing about us without us, it is such a core important piece of how this looks. And that even means, and I didn't say this before, but that even means that a lot of times that, that may mean that I'm not the one that's in charge of that project. Like that means that sometimes I'm like, you know what, I'm not the person for this. So I'm going to step off of that and give this to somebody else because I'm not the best person for that. So, we all want to help and we all want to do something because it's hard to watch an inequity or something that we think is unfair or unjust and not do something. And a lot of people, feel like, well, of course we want to feel like we're the best people to be in charge of that, or we're in a position of power that like we can make a decision or we could do the work. But that doesn't mean that that's who's best for that. Sometimes some of our best ideas and our best project execution actually comes from the people who are on the floor living that work. And so you have to be ready to hand that over to them.
Very, very good. Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm not seeing any other questions. So I will pause for just a very brief moment. That uncomfortable pause that everybody hates, just to see if anyone has any questions before we wrap up. All right, well, that's about as long as I can handle a pause. I'd love to talk, as you guys can see. So with that, I'd like to sincerely and wholeheartedly thank Dr. Kyle Christensen, Dr. Jonna Cooley, and Dr. Melanie Andrews for your insight, your time. Please continue the work. We really appreciate, and we can see the passion as one of the one of the attendees just said, the passion that you guys have in this, and it's greatly appreciated. And we hope that many more people and many more organizations look to this and really take this to heart. And with that, to everyone in attendance, I'd like to thank you so much for your time and look forward to hearing from us very soon about what we're doing for 2021. Looks like it's going to be a few more of these type of things, because who knows when we're going to be together in person again, but we will ensure that you get some face-to-face hours. So thank you very much, everyone. Stay safe and happy holidays. And with that, Ricardo, I turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you to our moderator, Nicole Radford, and thank you panelists and everyone for your participation today. This concludes our session. Again, today's session is worth 1.5 hours of face-to-face education credit and will be applied to your ACHE accounts in approximately 2 weeks from today's session. Please be sure to complete the evaluation by visiting your My ACHE page and selecting My Online Learning from the Helpful Links section. From there, click on the Access My Courses link and you'll be directed to the LMS where you can complete the evaluation. The recording for this session will be posted in the LMS within 48 hours of today and will be available to download. Today's program is copyrighted in 2020 by the American College of Healthcare Executives, all rights reserved. Thank you for attending and continue to stay safe, everyone.